The Asia-Pacific region increasingly finds itself at the centre of tension and competition between the US and China. But we wanted to know how this week's result changes the picture. Charles Edel is a senior advisor at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. He's focused on Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific. And I asked him what Donald Trump's presidency will mean for US foreign policy in our region.
Well, it means some changes, that's for sure, but the details, which is where it will really matter, are pending. And I think we're all waiting to watch, because on a number of issues, if we're talking about trade and tariffs, if we're talking about closer alignment with traditional allies and partners, or embrace of authoritarian figures, if we're talking about climate change, all of these, I think, we'll have to wait to see not only the personnel that are in place, but where Trump's instincts take him.
Are there any clues from his first term as president that might give us a steer on what might happen?
Yeah, I mean, it depends really issue by issue. So we know, first of all, on the trade front, that, as he says, tariffs are the most beautiful word in the English language. This is something that he has returned to time and time again as a policy tool. It's also one that he said he would work on enacting from day one. At least 20% tariffs. If your name rhymes with China, we're talking about 60% tariffs. And we know that he has the ability to impose those. So I think we have more than a clear clue. We have a pretty clear policy priority that's going to come on at the outset. You know, in terms of China policy, it strikes me he's going to use those tariffs, but on some of the other parts of this, the technological competition, the military competition that America is in, the force posture that we're seeing around the region, those we don't have as clear answers to yet. On Ukraine, I think we also have a pretty clear indication of which way he's going to move. Now, ostensibly, that doesn't have as much to do with the Indo-Pacific region, but of course it does, because implications are felt, read, and understood, and then acted upon by global players. So depending on how hard of a settlement Donald Trump attempts to force Kyiv into, that can, of course, have likely implications in the Indo-Pacific as well.
What are those implications?
Well, the implications would be, if you were sitting in Taiwan, you were quite nervous, and if you're sitting in Beijing, you think that this might well play to your advantage.
So, presuming Donald Trump allows Russia to keep annexed land in Ukraine by stemming the supply of arms to Ukraine, how would Beijing interpret that? And would it increase the likelihood that Beijing might make some militaristic move on Taiwan?
Well, it might well increase that, but of course Beijing could read this in any number of ways, as might Trump and as might others. So on the one hand, you could see Xi Jinping reading this as, if you make a territorial move, you don't really pay a penalty, and the coalition that's been very full and very assertive against Vladimir Putin's assertive moves will ultimately fall apart. That is one read that you could have. On the other hand, if you listen to some of what those in Trump's orbit are saying, it's the stakes are highest in the Indo-Pacific, and therefore America has to do less in Europe. The Europeans have to do more for themselves, and this would allow them to concentrate more on the main contest with China in the Indo-Pacific. So that might be more deterrence on this. You know, there's another factor too about how other partners would read this. So if you are a European who is increasingly concerned about what China has been doing with their markets, with subsidies for their markets, with human rights abuses, but also on the security front, and you have increasingly been working with Indo-Pacific partners, New Zealand is one of them, and no longer is the United States willing to help lead the coalition, there's an open question about how much Europeans would be willing to contribute to security in the Indo-Pacific region.
Donald Trump talks about peace through strength. In the Pacific, what does that actually mean?
Peace through strength is undefined. I mean, at the top level, I think it means that America will become so powerful that it would deter any potential adversaries from making aggressive moves against it. It's the core, the essence of deterrence. Now, that has a lot of different implications, talking about what we're meaning. On the pure security front, it means a larger military presence, a more powerful military presence, and that would probably have to mean greater investments internally in the United States to the Department of Defense, but also presumably alongside American allies and partners who are willing to pay more, contribute more for their own defense, and alongside the United States. But of course, that also, because the competition is being fought across multiple vectors now, means on the technological front, no less on the economic front as well.
How does Donald Trump think about Taiwan?
Well, we have more than one indication of which way he thinks. which means that we should probably back up, Jack, and say that the number one thing that Donald Trump thinks about when he thinks about statecraft is tariffs. But the number two thing he thinks about and sees as a strength for himself is his unpredictability. He thinks it's a problem when America's red lines are too clear, and he has said repeatedly that I know Xi Jinping, I respect Xi Jinping, and he knows I'm crazy. That is, he's unpredictable. Now, when we focus down on Taiwan, there are a couple of different things. So on the one hand, during his administration, the first time around, he had an unprecedented series of outreach and phone calls with Tsai Ing-wen, who was Taiwan's president at the time. Much more outreach to them. If you look at the advisors who circle around them, much more involvement with Taiwan. We've also seen him increasingly push Taiwan to invest much more in its own security. And then on a tertiary level, we could say that Taiwan, which he seems to support, he also sees as useful leverage for bargaining with China. His own advisors from his first administration, John Bolton and others, have said that he sees potential trade space with China on Taiwan over trade issues. That would be, of course, disastrous. It would mean the end of Taiwan's independence. How this plays out, all three of those vectors intersecting, is something we're going to be watching very closely during the second administration.
Think about the extent to which the US has tried to invest in domestic chip manufacturing in recent years. If America gets to a point sometime soon where it is no longer as dependent on Taiwan for chip manufacturing, does that lessen Taiwan's importance to Donald Trump?
It could well, because we know that Donald Trump has said that Taiwan is stealing our business on this. Now, Taiwan has also invested in the United States during this period. But of course, I'll make the larger point that Taiwan's value for the United States, for the world, is not only about its chips. It's a democracy. It is a country that has strategic geography for itself. There are a lot of reasons why Taiwan is important. But of course, you're not asking me. The question is about how Donald Trump would view this. And the question becomes unknown as, and I think that it's a bit unknowable about Taiwan's value in and of itself.
Is there merit in that unpredictability approach? I mean, I think about the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, for example.
Yeah.
Is there actually merit in that?
There is no doubt that being somewhat unpredictable towards adversaries is absolutely advantageous because they don't know where your red line is. Now, we probably need to qualify that a little bit further, Jack, and say that being totally unpredictable to adversaries can be problematic too, because they actually don't know where your red lines are and they might trip over them, and then you find yourself in a really bad position. But without a doubt, there is merit to being somewhat unpredictable in relations with adversaries and keeping them guessing and therefore on their back foot, and I think that's how Trump sees it. But there's another part of the question too, which is you can't cabin off unpredictability just for adversaries if you're saying it very loud, if you're saying it very regularly, if you're saying it on Twitter for the entire world to hear. And the question is, what does that unpredictability inject into America's relationships with its allies and partners as well? And I think it's less of a stabilizing factor than it might potentially be with its adversaries.
What will a Trump presidency mean for AUKUS?
Well, we don't know the answer to that yet. The Australians have said they're quite confident about this. Frankly, many Americans on the Hill, congressmen, senators, have said that they see broad support for this. But Trump actually hasn't said anything about AUKUS himself. The president has a lot of power in our system, so we have to see what that looks like. Now, listen, on the top of this, as you well know, as your viewers know, there are multiple parts to AUKUS. There's the nuclear-powered submarines part, Pillar 1, and then there's the suite of advanced and emerging technologies with which the three original partners and potentially New Zealand, Canada, and Japan might also collaborate together. In terms of the argument for AUKUS, on the surface of this, I think this makes a lot of sense and will be quite appealing to Donald Trump. It's investments in the United States as well as into other countries. It's the amplification in many ways of US power, and it's allowing America's, in many ways, most trusted allies to become more powerful in and of themselves. That's a pretty good argument for it.
How should Donald Trump's presidency change the way New Zealand thinks about AUKUS Pillar 2?
Well, I think because we haven't yet defined what the on-ramps are or what the door handle looks like for ascension to AUKUS Pillar 2, it will very much affect how Wellington thinks about what it is required to do and what it is potentially likely to get out of the deal. So if Wellington sees that these are a suite of technologies that will come to them and that are useful for New Zealand to have in a much more contested environment, and that it has not only a clear ascension, but it's likely to retain some of these, I would imagine it would have some appeal to them. The question is, on what timeline, what price has to be put in? As one administration official said to me at one point when we were talking about Pillar 2, this is not a club simply to be joined. This has to be, because of the nature of what we're talking about, an organization that countries sign on to where they bring resources, bring know-how, and are willing to take what is developed and deliver it to their military as well.
Right, to their military as well.
Correct.
Yeah. Would New Zealand have the capacity to do that?
Absolutely it would. If we're talking about a suite of advanced and emerging technologies, everything from AI to quantum to some missile technology to kind of the way that radar talks to each other, absolutely New Zealand would have the capacity to do this.
But why should New Zealand consider AUKUS Pillar 2 if it risks our relationship with our biggest trading partner?
Well, first of all, you're asking me to make a political argument here, Jack. I would say there are almost anything that New Zealand does to defend itself in the security realm would, quote unquote, risk New Zealand's relationship with China, or at least that's what Beijing would say. New Zealand, amongst other things, has to make some very large decisions very soon about what its Navy is going to look like. It has to recapitalize its fleet. That is a decision that I cannot imagine New Zealand would not undertake in some form or another. We're waiting for the defense plan to roll out over the next couple of weeks. That is something that Beijing will holler about, whatever the decision that is. Now, I shift from that point to the next point, which is, why would New Zealand not want its military to have access to the most cutting-edge technologies that are being developed at this point? That makes eminent sense. It already has the ability to work almost seamlessly across the Five Eyes Alliance. This is another aspect of that. So the question is, what positions New Zealand best in a much more contested environment where technological acceleration is really charging ahead?
I suppose the answer to that would be, what is the point in advanced military technology if we take a massive economic hit? And that's the risk in the eyes of many New Zealanders.
Yeah. Oh, what say I for this? So you're asking me for a full-on argument here, Jack.
Well, yeah.
I would say most of the time that decisions that are made for sovereign reasons are actually understood by Beijing, and their threat is always worse than their delivery on this. And there's another larger point here, I think, in this conversation, which is China is New Zealand's largest trading partner. It's not New Zealand's only trading partner. Many of the commodities that we're talking about that New Zealand sells are fungible. They are sold on global markets. So the question is, what type of resilience and redundancy the New Zealand markets, the private sector, and the government is willing to support to make sure that it has more resilience and more options.
Again, though, under a Trump presidency, we are facing the possibility of tariffs. So not only do we not have a free trade agreement that might make up for some potential lost trade with China, we're potentially facing greater barriers to entering the US market.
That's true.
Yeah, and in the eyes of New Zealanders who are considering this AUKUS proposition, it surely makes it less of an attractive proposal.
You have a good point there, Jack. I would simply say that, the days that we cabin off and keep completely separate economic and defense decisions, I think are gone because of the way that security has evolved at this point. The two bleed into each other very much, and the question is, what's best going to keep New Zealand most safe and most prosperous? So this is a balance, as you put that. It's not black or white.
Yeah, and I think about that argument about, for example, having to recapitalise our Navy and invest in our Defence Force, regardless of whether or not we're part of AUKUS Pillar 2. I suppose the difference here is that joining that organisation or that pact would mean that we are explicitly aligning ourselves with countries in a way that we might not be if making those investments but remaining somewhat sovereign. Do you think it is going to be...
I just have to stop you there because
sure.
I think this is a problem in how it's phrased. Not your wording,
No.
Jack, but the question is what increases New Zealand's sovereignty? And the way that I heard you phrase this is in ways that kind of bite into and seal off New Zealand's sovereignty. I think a more useful way of thinking about this is what gives New Zealand more options to do more things. That means partnership. Otherwise, it doesn't have access to many of these technologies. So again, this is a debatable point, but it strikes me as increasing New Zealand's options as an independent sovereign nation means making sure that it has more wherewithal to do as much.
New Zealand's forever trying to walk this line, balancing our economic interests and trading relationship with China with our security interests. Is it going to be a sustainable strategy to continue walking that line?
It depends. None of us can predict the future, but I think that it's becoming harder for all nations. There's no doubt about that. And that's partially true because the environment is becoming so much more fraught. And we can see that, if nothing else, that the context that Trump is taking the presidency is fundamentally different than it was in 2016. Not only has China become much more assertive under Xi Jinping, but we've seen this increasing dynamic where there's collaboration between not only China and Russia, but North Korea and Iran as well. That is presenting a host of new challenges that we did not have to deal with 8 years ago, that are presenting countries with some starker choices about what the landscape looks like and what they need to do to best set themselves up.
Is Donald Trump going to be as willing as the Biden administration has been to invest in things like soft power in the Pacific?
Look, on the surface of it, no. And we also know that it's, in some ways, the kind of renewed American effort for diplomacy in the Pacific, which has very much been done with much counsel and good advice from New Zealand, is something that is just less appealing to Donald Trump. How do you manage relations with the Pacific Island nations when climate change is no longer part of your political vocabulary? Right? That's a bigger challenge. That said, there are many on Trump's team who know the strategic importance of the Pacific Island region. In fact, keener attention to this region, I should say, started under Donald Trump's presidency. They had a director in the White House on the Pacific for the first time in the National Security Council. Folks are well aware of this, and frankly, let's be honest, so too are Pacific Island leaders. They know that using the word climate change or the words climate change is less likely to be useful in dealing with a Trump presidency. Using phrases, working with the new administration on initiatives like resilient infrastructure might get them to the same place with a different vocabulary. Will it be harder? Absolutely it will.
That's interesting, though. You think it might just require some thoughtful reframing on behalf of those Pacific nations that are most concerned about climate change?
I think that's part of it, but that's not all of it, obviously. So reframing, re-engaging, working with the Trump administration, having the Trump administration work with them, absolutely that's part of it. But some of the challenges become harder because you really have to do nuance if you do the Pacific. You have to talk the language of the Pacific. You have to make sure that you are talking about the major security challenges, which start and oftentimes end with climate change. All of those will obviously become much more challenging under a Trump presidency that tends not to do nuance.